This picture is probably familiar to you because it's the best known photograph in the world. It was taken in 1936. It's called Migrant Mother, and it was taken by an American woman named Dorothea Lange. Kind of as an addendum to the photography talk that I just gave in a previous video, I wanted to talk a little bit about Dorothea Lange because I think she's an interesting artist, particularly in the photography genre, because not only did she take pictures in a fine art way, but her art was social commentary, journalistic, and fine art all rolled into one. And we've talked a lot in the past about how art can serve multiple purposes. I think this particular picture is an excellent example of that. So I'm Wendy Adler, your host of Articulating, and I was going to talk to you briefly about Dorothea Lange, just to give you a little perspective. She was born in 1895, lived till 1965, and born to a wealthy family in New Jersey, German immigrants, and she's considered a German American. In 1902, she came down with polio at age 7, which left her walking with a limp for the rest of her life. She was very self-conscious of this limp. She didn't like being seen as disabled or handicapped, but unfortunately, she was saddled with it for the rest of her life. She didn't like going to school, so she would cut school a lot and she would wander around Manhattan as a young girl. She was exposed to the Stieglitz Gallery, which we spoke of at length in our last talk on photography. And she saw a lot of Stieglitz's work and the work of Paul Strand and other photographers of the day, and decided that she wanted to become a photographer even before she had ever held a camera in her hands. She and a friend at the age of 18 left New York with the idea of taking pictures around the world. They made it as far as San Francisco, and then she was pickpocketed. They lost all their money, and that's where she settled as an 18-year-old girl in the city of San Francisco in the early 1900s. So what did she do? She got a job at a drugstore working in photo processing. So even 100 years ago, people would take their photographs to the drugstore to be processed, like we all used to do before we had cameras on our phones. So in 1919, Dorothea Lange gets a backer to help her open a portrait studio in San Francisco. San Francisco was a very wealthy city at this time, and so she had a lot of people that wanted to pay to have their family's portraits taken. And so she managed to mix and mingle with the upper crust. She had quite a celebrated list of clients, and she was involved in a lot of the social affairs of the city. She met a painter, his name was Maynard Dixon, and married him despite the fact that he was 20 years older than she was. He already has a daughter who becomes Dorothea's stepdaughter, and later on she and Maynard have 2 sons. She's not much of a parent. She's actually very interested and consumed by her work, much more so than she is about being a parent, and we'll see how that comes into play later. She and Maynard traveled to New Mexico. She loves to take photographs of the land, kind of like Ansel Adams, and she takes lots of pictures of the people and the new things that she's exposed to in New Mexico, things that she wouldn't have seen in her New Jersey upbringing or in her high society San Francisco mixings. She takes a picture of some poverty that really stays with her and kind of sets the course for what she's going to end up doing for the rest of her life. This particular picture is called White Angel Breadline. This was taken in 1933. And it shows the poverty and the desperation of the public post-World War I and pre-World War II after the Depression had hit our country. And this really moves her. She wants to capture the everyman, but the everyman is kind of depressing. And her pictures really tell a story. So White Angel Breadline became one of her best-known works later in her career when she finally was famous. She takes another picture at the time of a woman sitting on a stoop mending her stockings. And so she's taking pictures of the everyday man or woman doing everyday things, but she's really kind of setting a tone and showing people who live in a bubble what it's like outside of the bubble. This was the first time that photography had really been regarded in that way. So she's using it as a tool. She meets Paul Taylor, who had been a very esteemed professor at the University of California, Berkeley. He was a professor of labor economics and later became chair of their economics department. His primary research was in farm labor, and he would also use a camera to document what he saw, particularly in California. And he used it as a form of visual note-taking. This was a very pioneering move. He would use these photographs that he took based on things he saw to document the conditions that farm laborers particularly were living in. Paul Taylor hires Dorothea Lange as a typist, but he's discovered Dorothea's talent, and of course they fall in love, and later on they both ditch their spouses of the day and end up married to each other. Happily, by the way. So it's a good story, but it's not a good story with great beginnings. Anyway. Back to Paul Taylor. He hires Lange as a photographer, and he and Lange are going to go document out in the field the Emergency Relief Association's efforts in California. So they're hired by a government agency in California to document automobile migrants. So automobile migrants were Americans that had started to move west or move up from the south into California to help during agricultural seasons. So these migrant workers were actually American citizens, mostly very poor people in America, that were still looking for the American dream and trying to make their way and trying to decide where to settle. And California was seen, of course, as the land of golden opportunity, particularly if you were willing to go work in the fields. However, the people in the fields were not treated very well. They didn't have unions, they didn't have a lot of breaks, it was hot and it was dusty, a lot of them were living out of their cars. And so Paul Taylor and Dorothea Lange took it upon themselves to go and document this. They would drive from season to season and field to field and document the harvesters as they worked. He mostly did the interviews, and she did most of the photography. A lot of Dorothea Lange's photographs are published in a book later, which I have, that have narration. And the narration is employed by Paul Taylor to the pictures that were taken by Dorothea Lange. So they worked as a team, and they captioned these photos, either with quotes from the subject or just notes from their own observations. They form this government report, and Taylor submits it, and it's unlike any report that the government had ever been given before about the treatment of Americans in this situation. So this was land-breaking. And I think because of the strength of the work, that's what caused Taylor and Lange to fall in love and live happily ever after. So this is also the time of the Dust Bowl, and it is literally named the Dust Bowl, as many of you probably know, because things were dusty. Newly settled land was not established, so the soil was not wet or deep. There weren't a lot of roots established, and so when these storms would kick up with lots of wind, the dust would blow and you couldn't see, and it was horrible. So the conditions of the Dust Bowl were not good. There were a lot of very poor people, and as I said before, a lot of them were migrants that were looking for work and trying to make money and trying to figure out where they were going to establish themselves. Paul Taylor observes this as an economist, and he sees that this is a big issue with a lot of these immigrants wanting to come and be family farmers and trying to figure out how to make that work. So Dorothea takes a picture called Tractored Out. Grab the wrong book. Here we go. Tractored Out. I think this is a really interesting picture. I didn't realize the impact of this picture when I first saw it, but it shows an abandoned house that's basically been surrounded by what looks like tractor tracks, right? And I think what it's trying to show is both hope in the fact that we have this newly established field, But it's also showing despair in the sense that we have the abandoned house in the middle of this field with no signs of life. So her pictures really tell a pretty poignant story and make a strong impact with very little effort there. So Tractored Out shows the hope and the despair of these migrant workers. So along comes Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, which includes a resettlement administration called the Farm Security Administration. We've talked about this before. It's a large FSA program, and it runs from 1935 to 1939. And Dorothea Lange actually works for this project. She takes photographs to help document the plight of these workers. She's hired by Roy Stryker, who heads the program, to introduce America to Americans. So they're going to use Dorothea Lange's photographs to help tell the story of what's happening in America before World War II has struck and after World War I. She publishes a book called Six Tenant Farmers, where she's documented what's gone on in the evolution of farming for these people. And she learns how to become unseen. She learns how to blend in and take photographs without being obvious and without having people pose for them. So she's using almost candid shots, and she's getting to know her subjects by talking to them without the camera pointed in their faces and learning how to best capture the poignancy of their situations. She photographs this in over 30 different states before the job is complete. On the way home, back to California after this job, she's driving up the California freeway and she sees a sign on the road that says Pea Pickers Camp. She drives past the sign because she's anxious to get home to her kids, but then something nags at her and she feels like she has to go back. So she U-turns the car and she goes back to the Pea Picker Camp sign. And that's where Migrant Mother comes into play. She drives into the Pea Picker Camp and she sees this woman. She's a woman of 7 children. She's about 32 years old, and she never gets asked her name by Dorothea Lange, but Dorothea asks if it would be all right to take her photograph, and for the woman to please tell Dorothea how did she end up in this Pea Picker Camp. So the Migrant Mother, whose name is actually Florence Owens Thompson, which we didn't know until the 1970s, believe it or not. So Florence Thompson tells Dorothea that she and her family of 7 children and her husband were in their car on their way to look for work when the car broke down. And it broke down close to the Pea Pickers Camp, and they didn't have the money to fix their car. So she was at the Pea Pickers Camp trying to work and build up enough money to be able to go back on their way. In the meantime, they have no money. They sell the tires from their car, which of course now even further disables their car, and they're stuck in a vicious circle. They're eating frozen vegetables, which were plentiful because they were picking vegetables in the field, so they had vegetables, but they're really only eating frozen vegetables and birds and squirrels that the children would kill when they were out playing and hunting. So this is a very destitute family. Dorothea Lange captures that, I think, in the woman's face. The children in this picture are turned away from the camera. Maybe they're embarrassed, maybe they're shy, we don't really know. But we can see the anxiety and the stress and the just the disappointment of life in this woman's face. It's really a very poignant picture. Lange took about 7 pictures of this woman and her children over about a 10-minute period, and then packed up her car and off she went home. The picture was, it didn't pay Dorothea Lange anything, it didn't pay Florence Owens Thompson anything, but the picture was published in the San Francisco newspaper the next day, before the government had seen it. And because the picture was so moving, it actually spurred a movement of relief money and aid to be sent to the migrant workers, all because of this photograph that was taken by Lange. Owens Thompson never benefited from this picture because we didn't even know who she was until the 1970s, and there were no royalties being paid. This picture had been taken on the government's dime. So Lange never even made any money from it either. And yet we can see this picture all over, and it's used in so many different contexts, even still today. So Lange and Taylor persist, and they go and they document about 15 to 18 different migrant camps, making sure that the better conditions are being built over time. Their studies are the basis for John Steinbeck writing The Grapes of Wrath, where the main character, Tom Collins, is actually based on one of the managers of one of the camps that Taylor and Lange helped to establish. They drive to the southeastern United States and they witness sharecropping, and they're seeing African Americans starting to establish their own farms, and they take pictures of that. They see the human erosion, and they start to document human rights. We have a picture here called Plantation Overseer. And it's an interesting picture. It's a little benign when you first look at it. But then if you examine the positioning of the white man and the positioning of the African Americans, and what kind of discussion are they having? And what could they possibly be talking about? Is he their boss? Is he their overseer? Is he just somebody that happened to stop by the store? So her stories tell us pictures, and they make us think a little bit, not just of the narration of the story, but also of the context and what was happening in history and society at the time. So she and Taylor continue on their way. And in 1942, the American government decides on the Japanese internment camps, right? This was a side effect of Pearl Harbor and the invasion. Lange is incensed. She's not happy with the decision of the government to segregate these Japanese families that had been establishing themselves in our country for quite a long time. You might remember she was from San Francisco, where there was quite a bit of Asian immigration and strong Asian population. And so she really felt like these Japanese internment camps were almost a blight on America. So she did take pictures. She received permission to take pictures of the Japanese internment camp. I think this particular picture is very moving. It shows a family getting ready to go on their way, and they have tags as if they're pieces of merchandise or rolled up rugs or something. Those tags become their form of identification. You don't really see the Japanese looking angry in this picture. They look kind of resolved and confused, right? And I think that's how generally the Japanese were taking this particular verdict, that they were going to have to be interned. So she documents those. She's actually given permission to go into their camps and take pictures in the camps. But the government doesn't like the way that those pictures come out. They particularly don't like the fact that the shadows that Lange manages to capture look like prison bars. These slats of shadows look like prison bars. And the government also doesn't like that she takes pictures of the guards in the camp, looking somewhat like Nazi prison guards. So the government says, no, 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 we won't allow you to publish those. So those were not published for several years until afterwards. In 1963, she and Taylor take a world trip. Her health is beginning to fail. So even though she still takes pictures, she's not working now for anybody. He is still working. But she's just using it as an exercise in vision, just being able to kind of open her world a little bit more, and continues to take pictures that actually veer a little bit more towards artistic as opposed to just journalistic. In 1964, the Museum of Modern Art approaches her and wants to put together of Lange's work. She is instrumental in helping them arrange the work and decide the narrative that she wants portrayed in this exhibition. But sadly, she's dying from cancer of the esophagus by this point, and she passes away 3 months before the show opens in January of 1966. She and Taylor founded the magazine Aperture, which is a photography magazine that I believe is still in print today. It's published quarterly. And she had a strong impact in other photographers, even modern day photographers. I could have highlighted other photographers such as Walker Evans, who also worked strongly with the WPA. I could have talked about Henri Cartier-Bresson, who was a French photographer of city life. But I chose to highlight Dorothea Lange both because Migrant Mother was such an impactful photograph, but also because I think it ties in nicely with how it is that photography can be used as something to communicate as well as an artistic, aesthetic piece of art. So I hope you enjoyed our talk about Dorothea Lange, and I look forward to bringing you another video soon. Thank you.